I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of the new Climate and Cryosphere webinar series. It's being organized by the World Climate Research Program Project for Climate and the Cryosphere, which is now housed here at the University of Massachusetts. And I'd like to introduce Megan Taylor. And take your mask off for a sec.
Hi, thank you.
Megan will be running the webinar for the rest of the semester, and Megan will distribute the titles of the other talks and the dates for those of you who are interested. Each talk will be recorded, and there'll be a website with the recordings archived on them. So with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Lonnie Thompson, who is well known, I'm sure, to everybody on this webinar. Lonnie's a distinguished professor at The Ohio State University, and among his many other distinguished attributes, he's the National Medal of Science winner. I think he received the medal from George Bush. Is that right, Lonnie?
George W. Bush, absolutely.
So with that introduction, let me hand it off to Lonnie, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ray. It's my pleasure to be able to talk this morning to Climate and Cryosphere CLIC group. And I hope we have a mix of professors and students for this presentation. I want to talk about tropical glaciers and stories from those, but also some of the social impacts of change. I want to point out that this has always been a team effort here, and on the left here we have our current team members here in our research group. We have collaboration with the microbiology department and with modelers Sinja and Liu over in geography, and we have a lot of national and international collaborators. And without that, it wouldn't be possible to do what we've done. I put together kind of a fact sheet about our group here. It's the longest and sustained and successful climate and environmental research program here at OSU, and it has had national and global implications. We have the most geographically diverse collection of ice cores here, which is very unique. And we have over 300 peer-reviewed publications, 12 in 2022 and 12 in 2023, and we're on our way for this year. We have extensive participation in national and international research programs and scientific organizations, and we have a very active education and outreach program. And this year, in 2023, in September, we actually released a documentary, Canary, and I'll talk a little more about that toward the end. I want to talk about some perceptions and reality, and kind of give a little bit of history for those who may not know me. I actually came to Ohio State back in 1971 to study coal geology. Having grown up in West Virginia, I was looking to get a job. And in my first quarter here, I was offered a research position in what was then the Institute of Polar Studies to study ice. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm not sure how you make a living looking at ice. But I didn't realize how much ice there is on the planet, and ultimately did a PhD comparing the dust record from the very first ice core drilled through Greenland at Camp Century with the very first ice core drilled through Antarctica at Byrd Station. And it was in doing that that I realized that there's a huge distance between these two locations, and started thinking about could we find anything in between to connect those records. It's amazing when you look at the scale of Greenland, and you can see that it's actually smaller than the area of Peru and Bolivia. And this is because of the fact that we do live on a sphere. And as a result of that, there's only about 17% of our area of this planet in the polar regions, but there's 50% located between 30 north and 30 south. And that's also where we have over 50% of our 8 billion people living. So it's very important to understand both natural and human-driven changes from those parts of the world. The other very important factor, and of course, people in California today recognize this, is that through these atmospheric rivers, that the water vapor in our atmosphere is actually coming mainly from the tropics. We have 37% of the ocean surface area between 20 north and 20 south. And the evaporation from this part of the world drives the water vapor flux in our atmosphere. We've been very fortunate to not only drill in Antarctica and Greenland in my career, but also in 16 different countries, and to put together a global picture of climate as recorded in ice from around the world. And to do this, you have to have laboratories, and here we have class 100 clean rooms in which we measure the dust and the chemistry in the ice cores. We have mass spectrometers to measure isotopes of oxygen. We have Coulter counters for doing size distribution, SP2s for black carbon measurements, element 2 for doing trace elements in these cores. And we have a storage facility. We have over 7,000 meters of ice stored at minus 30 degrees C. And this is what it takes to operate. And then you also have to have drills. And we had to come up with our own designs of lightweight portable drills in order to get to these high elevation sites in the mountain regions around the world. But for those who are starting, when we started this program over 50 years ago, there were very little availability of funds for looking at ice. And the only program was polar programs. And in 1973, we took aerial photographs of this Quelccaya ice cap to the program manager, who was Jay Zawali at the time, and made the case of why it would be important to connect Greenland with Antarctica. And he listened, and when I finished, he said, you know, Lonnie, that sounds like it could be important, but we can't fund it because it's not north of the Arctic Circle or south of the Antarctic Circle, and that was the only thing they funded. So in 1974, I went to Antarctica. I was disappointed in that response, but in February, I got a telex from the program manager. It said, Lonnie, I've funded all of my real science projects, and I have $7,000 left. What could you do on that tropical glacier for $7,000? And I telex back and I said, I think we could get there. So in the summer of 1974, we made our first trip, 4 of us, to find this ice cap. And it was a 2-day journey from the end of the nearest road by horse. And you can see, this is my first view of the ice cap. This is about 19,000 feet. It's at 14 degrees south of the equator and sits right above the Amazon. But I had no idea of the challenges the next decade would bring. How do you drill this, and how do you get ice out of this remote part of the world? And in order to do this, we had to ultimately come up with new drills, lightweight drills that people could actually carry, or you could put on a pack animal. We had to come up with a new power source because you couldn't use the generators that were available at that time in Antarctica. And so on these horses, in each of these red are solar panels that allowed us to produce the very first solar-powered ice core drill that allowed us to drill 2 ice cores to bedrock back in 1983. If you go back to that time, not even the National Science Foundation believed solar power would be an effective way to recover, to drill ice cores. But it turns out if you're 20,000 feet, you have over half the Earth's atmosphere below you. So these panels, even then, were producing 20 to 30% above specs, which allowed us to recover those cores. Now, ice cores are amazing because they record not just climate, things like temperature through the isotopic compositions, for precipitation through the annual layer thicknesses that we can measure in these cores, but they also record the forcings of climate. So we can look at volcanic eruptions, tephra, sulfate in these cores. We can also look at how the output of the sun has varied through time by measuring cosmogenic nuclides, chlorine-36, beryllium-10, and probably one of the most important records that come out of the ice cores is the history of the greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, all preserved in the bubbles that are archived in the ice. So they're a wonderful indicator of climate change. But they also respond to climate change. And in some ways, I think in today's world where we have difficulty finding out what the truth is, and with AI, this is going to become more challenging. But for me, the glaciers are kind of a truth serum. They simply sum up everything that's going on in their environment, and they respond to it. They cannot, they have no political agenda as such, and they cannot be lobbied or bought out by special interest groups. They just respond to climate. And we've been able to document those changes through time. So on the left here is Corycalis. This is the largest tropical ice cap, a tropical outlet glacier coming off of Quelccaya, which is the largest tropical ice cap. And this is in 1978. In 1991, there was a lake that started to form here. And 40 years later, in 2018, this is what this valley looks like. And that lake covers 84 acres. It's over 60 meters deep and did not exist until 1991. On the right, you can see these beautiful annual layers, and that's what I saw on those first trips to Quelccaya. I knew there was a history here, but how do you get it was another challenge. But this is what it looked like in 78, 24 years later, same place. And it brings home the message that you're losing this archive of our past, but you're also losing a very valuable water resource for the people who live downstream from this glacier. We were very fortunate to make our very first trip since the pandemic back to Quelccaya in 2023. Unfortunately, the retreat continues. You can actually see in the bedrock how it's risen here. You see bedrock going up over the horizon being exposed as this ice cap continues to deteriorate under present climate conditions. The importance of the ice cap is in many different perspectives, but particularly for local people. Local people see Quelccaya not as a physical entity, but as a living being that provides water for their alpaca in this very remote high elevation site. On the left here is a picture of Corycalis in 2005 in this lake. And you see a pasture down here where they grow their alpaca. And this family has 400. It's the only thing you can raise at these elevations. And then this is a year later, and you can see that this pasture is covered with sediment. They lost a lot of their alpaca. They drowned when there was an avalanche that came off of this ice cap, fell into the lake, and produced a mini tsunami. But the point here is this would have never occurred before 1991 because there was no lake in this valley. There are a lot of lakes forming at these very high elevation sites. This August, we met with the people in Fanaya, presented them a map that showed what Quelccaya looked like when we first started working there, and then what it looks like in 2023, showing that we've lost over 40% of the area since I was a graduate student in this remote part of the world. The good thing that happened is that using our 50 years of data, the Peruvian government has now set Quelccaya aside as a climate and a geopark preserve. And so that there's now tourism developing, and these local people in Fanaya have a new source of income. But this is an interesting photograph of the North Lobe Lake here. In 1984, there was no lakes here. The ice was down here on the margin. And since then, it's retreated. about 500 meters up this valley, but it's also exposed a rare collection of tropical plants. This ice cap has captured these plants, and we found the first plant being exposed along this retreating margin. This is what it looked like in 1977. There's now a lake in here, and this is a person, so this is about 30-meter high wall. And as that wall retreats, it exposed this plant deposit. And we were able to collect those plants. They're wetland plants. There's no woody tissue, but they're perfectly preserved. And those first plants dated 5,200 years, carbon-14 dates. Since 2002, we continued to collect plants up until 2018. And the amazing thing about the plants is how well they're preserved. When you capture them being exposed, you can actually see the cell structure. Some of them even have flowers on them. And this particular plant dates over 6,600 years in age. So we have collected 62 plants along this valley, and we've been able to date those. And the oldest plants have just been exposed in 2018, and they were over 7,000 years in age. And they tell us this ice cap has not been smaller for over 7,000 years, because had these plants ever been exposed, they would have decayed. They wouldn't be there. And so by dating this collection, we were able to actually reconstruct the movement of this glacier down this valley during the middle Holocene, between 7,100 to 4,400 years ago. And if you do that, you can actually see the timelines of the advancement of the glacier down this valley. We were able then to take these data and then put them into a larger scale perspective from all the work that's been published by other researchers on carbon-14 dated samples in moraines, and kind of come up with a reconstruction of how Quelccaya has behaved during the Holocene. So if you look at this figure, you can actually see this. This is time on the left. This is years before present. So it's 14,000 years ago when we had a very large ice sheet. And then it shows the retreat coming up to 7,100 years ago, our oldest plants, then the advancing down the valley to the younger plants at 4,500 years ago, the advance during the little ice age, and then this very rapid retreat over the past 38 years. And it kind of gives a perspective. This line is the area of the ice cap based on satellite images in 1985. So you can see how the ice has advanced and retreated. But unfortunately, these are point sources, so you can't really tell the rates of change of advancement or retreat, except for that period for which we have the plant collection in the mid-Holocene. But you can take this record and you can compare it to the isotope record from Huascarán, which is 800 kilometers to the north of Quelccaya. And what you find is during this period from 7,100 years ago up until 4,500 years ago, isotopes, as if you take them as a temperature indicator, show that there was a gradual decrease in temperatures over this period, and the glacier advanced down the valley. You can see the little ice age here in this record, and the warming in the 20th century. So you have to go back, if you take the current isotopes, back to 6,000 years ago to find similar conditions to what we find today. And that's very consistent to what we see with this plant collection. The other thing that is very worrisome when you look at the history of Quelccaya over the last 38 years is that if you look at the area back in 1985, this is a blue curve here, and if you look at the snow cover, that's the pink line you see here. Most of the ice cap was an accumulation area. But if you look at 2023 using the Sentinel-2 imagery, you can see how much snow cover we have lost on this ice field. And one of the problems is Kilkaya is very flat. Once the zero isotherm rises above the summit, this ice cap will deteriorate very, very quickly. We see the similar stories playing out with the glaciers around the world. This is one of the sites that we drilled in Papua, Indonesia, used to be New Guinea. This is back in 2010, and we drilled 2 cores to bedrock on this dome and one on this dome. This is the North Wall Fern. And the amazing thing is what's happened with that ice through time. So this is actually a Landsat image of this region in 1992. This was the first year I testified before the US Senate, along with another group of paleoclimatologists, on our concern about climate change in these remote areas. The blue areas are the ice. This is 1992. This is 2009. And this is 2020. And if you look at our most recent images of this ice field, this is what it looked like when we drilled in 2010. This is December of 2022. You can see how much ice has disappeared. And this glacier, which is the only glacier between the Himalayas and the Andes, will disappear either this year or next year at the current rates of ice loss. And this same scenario is playing out. It doesn't matter what ice field you're looking at. These are 4 that we've actually measured: Kilkaya, the Papua, Indonesia, Kilimanjaro, Nanunami over in the Himalayas. And it brings to mind a story, an ancient philosopher in China, Lao Tzu, who said, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. And unfortunately for these mountaintop glaciers, they're all going to disappear under our current climate and our projected climate changes in these remote parts of the world. In fact, in the freezers here at Ohio State, we have 3 cores from glaciers that no longer exist in the natural world. And this makes it very important to see that these archives are preserved, because one of the things we found out during the pandemic is that if you cannot run expeditions to get new ice cores, then you have to use the archive to ask new questions and answer new science questions. And then in my career, what we can measure in the ice today, given technological advances, is much, much different than it was when we began. So having an archive is very important. And I want to point out just one of the outcomes of using that archive is that we had our first paper on microbes in the ice, preserved in the ice. It was published in Microbiome in 2021. And in this paper, we were able to determine the genetic code of 33 different virus species belonging to 32 genera, and 28 of those genera were novel, i.e. they had not been identified before. And one of the beauties of the collection we have here is we have a very geographically diverse collection of ice cores. So we're now looking at the microbes, bacteria, viruses, as they're preserved in these different parts of the world in these archives. And that's only possible because we have the archive. Another thing we have found is that there's some very unique microbial communities preserved in the ice. And this is just one example. This is from the Galea deep cores that we have, where the age of these cores suggests that they're over 500,000 years. And you can see that the similarity in the microbes in the upper part of this core, but you can see how different they are in the lower 30 meters. And this would suggest that, yeah, the conditions were much different back then. But only by having the archive can we actually investigate what's preserved in these cores. Another very important part of our program is our work in China. We have first went to China in 1984 when relations were normalized. And Yao Tangdong was a postdoc in our lab in the 1980s and 90s. And he now leads a very large group in Beijing and Lhasa. And in 2009, Yao Tangdong, Volker Moosberger from Germany, and I met in Chicago, and we launched what we call the Third Pole Environment Program. And we've since added co-chairs, younger people, to this group. And in 2011, the UNESCO, UNEP, and SCOPE jointly endorsed this Third Pole Environment Program as a flagship program for this international effort. We have had over 2,000 scientists involved from 30 different countries in this program over the years, and it's been quite successful, and a lot of good science is coming from that. There's a lot of serendipity in science, and one of the fortunate parts in our program here is that in the summer of 2019, we were successful in drilling the highest tropical mountain on Earth, Bhaskaran, and we drilled 2 cores of bedrock here in the claw and 2 cores of bedrock up on the summit. And these kept our lab running during the pandemic as we had these cores to process. Recovering the ice cores is logistically very challenging. And this is actually going up the Bhaskaran. You can see the researchers going up, but you can also see the equipment being carried up. We moved over 6 tons of equipment up to these drill sites. And so it takes a really major effort and couldn't be done without mountaineers and porters and local support that going into these programs. But we were successful in recovering 2 ice cores up on the col, above 6,000 meters, 165, 168 meters. And then on the summit, the highest ice cores ever recovered in the tropics from 6,768 meters. These are about 68-meter ice cores. And it turns out these have wonderful records, and we're in the process of developing those records. And one of the things we can measure now that we couldn't measure when we started was black carbon. And the black carbon is a indicator of fires. And on a clear day, you can actually see the smoke from the fires in the Amazon. And you can actually see the annual cycle every dry season of the black carbon from those fires. Just a couple months ago, we used the isotope records working with our Sinjin Liu here at Ohio State and another group of researchers to look at the proxy data, the isotopes, using climate models, also using modern satellite measurements of the delta 18 of the vapor in the atmosphere, and irradiative convective equilibrium theory to show that the delta 18 and the Bhaskaran ice cores are actually an indication of temperatures, at least for the period from 11,000 to 20,000 years ago. And we saw that this temperature decrease at the drill site would have been about 7.35 degrees C plus or minus 1.1 degrees C. It turns out that Bhaskaran is kind of in a Goldilocks position on our planet because of its elevation and its location at 9 degrees south. It's kind of in the proximity of the nodal point between the inner hemispheric sea salt temperature response. We know that when it gets warm in Greenland, it gets cool in Antarctica, and vice versa. When it gets warm in Antarctica, it gets cool in Greenland, and Bhaskaran kind of sits in the middle. So it's in an ideal position to record global temperatures because it does not, it's not impacted by that seesaw. Abrupt climate change, we can look at that in the past using ice cores. And having a collection of ice cores, we can look at the dust and the chemistry, and we can look at similarities in different records. And if you look at the last 10,000 years of records, say from Kilimanjaro, Huascaran, and up in the Himalayas, you'll see there's all of these show an event occurring sometime around 4,000 years ago. And this becomes very important in human history, perhaps, because it also corresponds to a period of extreme droughts that led to a rapid decline of the Akkadian culture in Mesopotamia, the Harappan civilization along the Indus River, the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and the Longshan culture over in Eastern China. And the question is whether those dust events are related to this drought and the collapse. And so we have the investigation ongoing on the Huascaran records, which shows this very prominent dust event, the largest in the last 17,000 years. And we're looking at the mineralogy, the dust, the composition, the isotopic signature, but we're also looking at environmental DNA preserved in that dust. And what we're trying to determine is whether that event represents a drought in the tropics in South America, where we have no records, or is it simply dust blowing out of the Sahara, which it does in today's world, and being preserved on Huascaran. And so we have recently been able to get 65 soil samples across the Bedeli Depression and the central part of Sahara, which is one of the largest dust sources on Earth. And we're in the process of looking for environmental DNA. Is there a way that we can trace that dust to the Sahara? And then there's the abrupt climate change in the present. And one of the beauties of this Huascaran record is because it's so high and it's so cold, the mean temperatures are -9 degrees C, it allows us to actually measure gases trapped in the bubbles in a tropical location. And this is important because the Amazon is the largest natural methane producer on the planet. And the easterlies carry the methane across and up over the Andes. And there's a lot of serendipity in science. And so there was in our 2019 expedition, in part because the president of Peru actually visited us, and there was a local uprising. We were able to get this Mi-17 helicopter and at no cost to the project. And we're able to transport our ice cores very rapidly from a hut up here on the side down to freezer trucks in the valley. So we can keep the ice very cold, which is very important for measuring gas on these cores. And so now we are producing the very first methane records from a tropical location. You know, our records come from, here's the Law Dome in Antarctica. And then the green curve is our methane records from Greenland. And these triangles are the methane measurements that we are producing from these Huascaran ice cores going back 1,500 years. And if you look at this record, you can see that in general, the methane levels were about 50 parts per billion higher coming up until the Industrial Revolution, when human-caused methane rose very rapidly. And now the methane is more tracing what we see in the southern hemisphere in Antarctica. And the amazing thing is that we have two cores. We have two cores from the summit and two cores from down on the plateau. And we were able to date these cores using techniques that are used in the polar regions. One of those is working with Jeff Severinghaus to measure delta 18 in the air, in the bubbles in the ice. And so we could actually see the waste divide delta 18 curve here in black, and you can see the delta 18 air from the samples from Waskerad. And this is how we put time onto this time scale. So if we take this and we put it into the longer record that comes from the call of Waskerad, this goes from 0 to 30,000, and this is the working time scale because we're still getting methane and delta 18 air samples. But this kind of puts us into a picture. So here's that 4,200 year event. And when you get in the last glacial, you can see these huge dust events. The green is the nitrate, which we believe is coming from NOx emissions from the Amazon, from the rainforest. And then this blue curve is our isotope record. You can see the Younger Dryas and the Bowling Alarid period. And we have methane. And if you look at methane, you can see the drop of methane during the Younger Dryas, increase during the warmer Alarid Bowling, and the decrease that occurs during LGM. So we think in the big picture, this record is correct. But what it is amazing is that when you look at these records, here is the summit core in brown here compared to the polar cores. The red curve is from the call, which is 700 meters lower. And this is if you look at the last 40,000 years, this is the methane from the summit. And here is the methane from the call. And the methane from the call is consistently about 200 parts per billion higher than what we see up on the summit or in the polar cores. And the question is, what's driving that? And so this is what we're thinking. When we were drilling, you could actually see the smoke from the Amazon fires, and it would move through the Andes. And you can see the peaks are in the free atmosphere above. And we think with those easterlies, not only is the smoke moving, but also the methane. And there's a image, this is from NASA, which actually shows methane production in different parts of the world. But you can see this orange color is methane coming out of the Amazon, and you can see how it backs up along the Andes. And so if we play this,
in South America,
you can actually see
the
how
Amazon River Basin and its
moves
adjacent
across with the
wetlands flood
easterlies.
seasonally. This creates an oxygen-deprived environment that is a significant source of methane. In the last 200 years, methane concentrations have more than doubled, mainly due to human activities.
So we believe that what we're seeing is actually in the lower elevation site, the production of methane through time from the Amazon. And we have a student who's working on her PhD, looking at this.
In South America,
Lamonte.
the Amazon River.
So let me kind of bring this to a conclusion by looking at the future. These are our projection of warming from 90 north to 90 south. And you can see the Arctic application, which we're well aware of, but there's also an application in the tropics and with elevation. These are the elevations of all the sites that we have recovered high mountain glaciers. And you can see that the projections are that temperatures will warm twice as fast, twice as much at the higher elevations. And if we look at our global view of ice cores that we have collected, we now know all of these that have the stars have a water table in, i.e. the records are being altered from the surface down. And we expect that this will continue and ultimately impact all the sites for which we have records. And I'm going to kind of close for it, for these low and mid latitude glaciers. Time is running out. I mean, this is very clear. It's a very clear message in the isotope records from the ice and also in what's happening with the area of ice. And if we look at our present time and the abrupt events, this is actually a view of Fort Myers in Florida as a result of Hurricane Ian. Over $100 billion lost, over 100 lives lost. And if we look at 2023, it's the extreme weather is even larger. So humans can live within a large range of climates, from baking deserts to the frozen Arctic, but only if we can predict the extremes and adapt to them. And in 2023, the US was struck by 28 weather climate disasters of over $1 billion, surpassing the previous record of 22 events, which occurred in 2020. So the question is, how do we make a difference? And in the last few minutes, I want to show this. Ellen always gets upset when I show this picture, but Charles Keeling was a good friend of ours, and he started these measurements of CO2 in our atmosphere back in 1958. And when you plot these out, you can see that not only are they rising, they are accelerating. And we have our IPCC assessment reports, the first one coming out in 1990. Every 5 to 7 years, one of these reports comes out. The science gets better. We have great documentation, but the take-home message here is that we're not changing the curve. We're not changing the trajectory. So over a decade ago, our daughter, Regina, told me, Dad, one more science or nature paper, no, one more ice core, you're not going to change the trajectory that we're on. So the question is, as scientists, how do we make a difference? So about 5 years ago, we had an opportunity, and we were contacted by producers out of LA to do a film, a documentary. And I had no idea how complicated a film is, but the whole idea of the film was to inspire the next generation of young people, and at the same time, make a call for action for the climate crisis that we're all now seeing unfolding. And so we produced this film, and I'm going to show you the trailer for the film. It's had a lot. This is something totally new for us, and we're hoping that it has the desired impact. So I'll share this with you. It's only about 3 minutes. In the old days, you took a canary into the mine. If it dies, then it's time for you to flee the mine. Glaciers are our canary in a coal mine. They are our early warning system for the planet. And they're telling us there's serious danger here.
Lonnie is a visionary. You saw our global climate history captured in these glaciers. What you needed was somebody adventurous enough to get into these remote locations and extract it.
Kilkaya, it's the largest tropical ice cap in the world. One of the pioneers in this field has said it's too high for human beings, and the technology does not exist to drill it. Science can only advance when you do things other people think can't be done. Everything was unknown from here to the ice cap and back. That's where the robbers and the murderers go. It was a wild, wild west. 70% of the tropical glaciers on Earth are in Peru, and every one of them are retreating. To see lakes forming that weren't there before, something very big was happening in this remote part of the world.
It was all in jeopardy. It gave him a new sense of mission.
Of all these glaciers, once they disappear, the history disappears. the archive that we have will be the only archive on the planet. I was on an expedition. There was something wrong. My doctor said, you have one option and one option only, and that is to have a heart transplant. They're not going to let you go to any mountain range on Earth. So what are you going to do?
Lonnie needs the mountains. She's not thinking that she could die in the mountains.
In life, you're either going to overcome whatever it is, or you're going to give into it. You got to be a fighter.
If things were easy, they would have been done before.
When you're on that hospital bed and there is nothing between you and death, the idea that you would ever run another expedition, how could it possibly happen? Talk about the speed of a glacier, you're talking about something really slow. That's not true anymore. Having gone through these near-death experiences, my take-home message was to help bring together the world with climate change. It's not that this problem can't be solved. We create it. If humans can create it, humans can solve it.
People don't know yet the importance of the work of Lonnie.
I don't believe there's anything that we cannot achieve. Okay, I think with that, I would close with this view of a sunset from Kelkaya from this year. And you can see a lot of those lakes in this image that have formed since we started conducting research in this part of the world 50 years ago. So with that, I would close and open it up for any questions or discussions. So thank you very much.
We'll clap on behalf of everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Open for questions now. Anybody have questions, please raise your hand or put up your little hand signal. I have just one observation, Lonnie, and you showed the dust record from Huascarán or the projected time frame based on the methane and so on. And those dust peaks in the LGM, they all coincide, as far as I could see, with Heinrich events. I'll send you a record that shows the timing of those because those were associated with a shift in the intertropical convergence that may be related to those dust peaks.
Yeah, but it's a good observation, and we're still working on developing that timescale. One of the big challenges we have in these high mountain glaciers that time gets so compressed in the lower sections, and so being able to sample methane or delta 18 air in a fine enough resolution to really tie down that timescale. Delta 18 in the air has a lifespan of about 1,500 years. And so it doesn't really give you precision. But the methane, which has a resonance time of a decade or so, works much better. But you have to be able to sample those very detailed changes that are annually dated in the polar cores. But so we're still fine tuning that record, but I think your observation is a good one. And one of the big questions is, yeah, what role did the tropics play in amplifying or driving climate change during these abrupt events during the late glacial stage? But you have to remember that the glacial stage in Huascarán is confined to in the original cores we drilled back in 1993, it was 3 meters. And these new cores, it is compressed to 2 meters.
Uh-huh.
And of course, up on the summit of Huascaran, that record goes back over 13,000 years, but it's only 68 meters in length. So time is really compressed at the bottom of that core. But exactly what the physics of ice would say should be happening.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Please just speak up.
Muted.
We have a question asking, what is your policy with respect to making previous ice available for new investigations? Knowing the tropical repository is limited and new technologies will be available in the future.
Now, we, as part of our documentary we produced, we have a fundraiser to expand and preserve the ice for the next generation of young scientists. And so we're working on doing that. We have the potential of getting a new research building here at Ohio State, and the new freezers potentially would be built in that new building. And so from our perspective, I mean, what we're trying to do is preserve them for the next generation, the young people, in both in our group here and around the world.
More questions? Comments? I have another question about the bacteria and the viruses in the ice. You seem to be getting a lot of bacterial infections and viral infections. Lonnie, are you sure you washing your hands after you deal with these things?
That's an interesting question, and there's a number of movies out that talk about the release of viruses and from these ancient deposits. I think there's a lot to be done here. I mean, you know, the whole issue of microbes. I mean, you know, they're a huge part of the biodiversity of this planet, and we know so little about them. And the beauty of the ice is it preserves it, freezes it in time. So we can look at how microbes change from different climates on the planet. We're also looking at, okay, what would you expect to happen in the future as the ice fields around the world warm? And what is clear is that whatever is in the ice is being released because the ice is melting. And but I always argue that there, on all of our field programs, we actually use the water from the glacier as drinking water. And the indigenous people who've lived downstream from these glaciers for thousands of years continue to survive quite well. So I think that if you look at all the sources of microbes on this planet, ice is probably the cleanest. And one of our biggest challenges was, how do you extract microbes, bacteria, viruses from such a low biomass material? And so we spent 6 years developing the protocol by which you would do that. And so I think that, yeah, you could, we certainly get that kind of questions from the media, but you have to remember that there are companies that bottle glacier water for drinking because of its purity. So I think it's a low risk activity.
Okay.
Further question asks about the dependence of major cities like Lima on meltwater from the Andes and how to build resilience as they vanish, as the meltwater is, you know.
This is an excellent question. And we were just in Cusco in September up in the Andes, and there was a water crisis in Cusco. The water in their reservoir, their lake, was the lowest it's ever been in recorded history. And of course, the glaciers are continuing to retreat. And I actually gave a lecture at the University of Cusco, and And the governor was there and I asked him, how can it be that you have a water crisis right now? Glaciers continue to retreat and you have a population growth. There's 1.5 million people who live downstream from the Kelkaya ice cap. A population growth of 2.5% a year. How are we going to sustain this going forward? And in cities like Lima, they already have water rationing. You get water maybe 4 days a week in your district. But they have plans like putting tunnels through the Andes to capture water that now goes into the Amazon on the eastern side of the Andes to bring the water back to the West Coast. But whatever solution there is, it's going to be expensive. And Peru is not a really wealthy country. So the cost of adaptation, and if you go to the grocery shopping, it's amazing that when you look at blueberries and asparagus, it's coming from Peru, and it's coming from the deserts on the West Coast, where they're irrigating from water that's coming from these glaciers. They're melting up in the Andes. And you look at that and you say, yeah, how can this be sustainable going forward? And I never quite figured out how commercially you can produce blueberries and asparagus and sell it in London and New York and make a profit on it. But they do. But yeah, the question is whether this is sustainable. So these are huge questions for the people who live in this part of the world.
Okay, well, I think we're all about out of time, so I'd just like to thank you, Lonnie, very much for another excellent talk. I'll just let people know that I think the next talk in this series is likely to be Rob DeConto and Dave Pollard talking about the Antarctic ice sheet and its vulnerability and its implications for sea level rise. So we'll advertise that and circulate information about how to log in for that talk. It'll probably be in 2 weeks, I think. So without further ado, thanks again, Lonnie. It was a great talk, and it was nice to see you and hear about all the latest results from your research. Take it easy.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, bye-bye.